Hey everyone, and welcome back. Glad to have you with us for another deep dive. Lately there's been this buzz, this kind of unsettling feeling that we might be, and I don't know, maybe reliving a bit of history with this whole satanic panic thing.
Yeah, it's definitely been cropping up in the headlines.
It's everywhere you look, and it's like,
Yeah.
is this real? Are people serious?
Yeah.
So we decided to dig into it, see what's. You guys sent us this article, and let me tell you, it is a doozy.
It's fascinating how this topic always seems to resurface, right? It's like it never truly goes away.
Right. It's like this weird echo.
It makes you wonder what's underlying it all.
Exactly. So to kick things off, let's talk about something that really got people worked up.
Yeah.
The 2024 Olympics opening ceremony. I mean, personally, I was glued to the TV, completely blown away by the whole thing. But then you had these right-wing commentators coming out swinging, saying the whole thing was satanic.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah. They were pointing fingers at all sorts of things. Like they had Gojira, the heavy metal band, performing.
Yeah.
And then there was this drag queen performance. And it seemed to be like referencing Da Vinci's Last Supper. It was actually pretty amazing, very avant-garde. But these commentators, they were having none of it.
It's interesting how they latched onto those specific elements.
Right. It's like they were looking for something to be outraged about.
It's like they had this pre-existing framework of what they considered satanic, and anything that even remotely touched on those themes was immediately deemed dangerous or threatening.
So are we saying these commentators are tapping into a similar kind of energy as, back in the day with the whole satanic panic thing?
It's definitely worth considering. For those who might not know, the term satanic panic refers to this period most prominently in the 1980s.
Yeah, I remember hearing about it.
It was a time when there was this widespread fear, this hysteria almost, surrounding anything that people perceived as satanic.
So, like, what fueled that panic back then? Was there any truth to it?
Well, it was a perfect storm of anxieties and, honestly, media hype. You had this growing awareness of child sexual abuse, which is obviously a very real and serious issue, but it got tangled up with all these totally unfounded claims about satanic cults.
Oh, wow.
And you can't underestimate the role of the media back then. I mean, this was before the internet, so television was incredibly powerful, sensationalized news stories, movies like Rosemary's Baby, The Omen, they all played into these fears, blurring the lines between fiction and reality.
So you're saying it was like this feedback loop of fear.
Exactly. And it's not so different today, just with a different medium. The internet, especially social media, has become this breeding ground for misinformation and fear-mongering.
Oh, absolutely. It's like 1 minute you're scrolling through cat memes, and the next you're staring at some graphic image supposedly linked to Satanism. It's wild.
And what's scary is that those things often coexist, right? You'll see this really dark, disturbing content right alongside something humorous or lighthearted, like the internet doesn't know how to differentiate.
It's true.
Yeah.
And it makes it that much harder to separate fact from fiction, especially when algorithms are designed to keep you engaged, regardless of whether the information is accurate or not.
It's like this constant bombardment of information, and it's difficult to know what to trust.
And the article brings up a really important point, which is that these narratives, even if they seem outlandish, they can have real-world consequences. And the article brings up this, really disturbing example of this with, Pizzagate.
Right. Pizzagate, it's like, unfortunately, it's become this textbook example of how these online conspiracy theories, they can just spiral completely out of control. And it's scary because they can lead to actual real-world harm. Like in the case of Pizzagate, you have this really unsettling mix of accusations about Satanism, child trafficking, this whole secret cabal of powerful figures pulling the strings.
It's crazy because I remember when that was happening, it was everywhere online. But I don't think I really grasped at the time how deep it went, how serious it became.
Oh, yeah, it totally took over. It was like this weird, dark corner of the internet that suddenly became, mainstream news.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it didn't stay online. It had these really serious offline consequences.
Yeah, like that guy who showed up at the pizzeria with a gun.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This guy, he was convinced that he was going to uncover this child sex trafficking ring, and he actually fired an assault rifle inside the pizzeria.
It's terrifying.
Yeah.
And the fact that no one was hurt is, a miracle.
It was incredibly lucky, right? It could have been a complete tragedy.
It's mind-blowing how people can get so caught up in these narratives, even when they seem so, so out there, so disconnected from reality.
Right.
What is it about these accusations, these theories, that makes them so powerful, so believable to some people?
Well, one thing the article talks about is how these types of theories, they often tap into these pre-existing prejudices, these societal anxieties that are already simmering beneath the surface. So it's not just about like a fear of Satan or the occult. It's about using those fears to target, to demonize specific groups of people, people who are already marginalized, already seen as different or threatening.
Like it's a way of channeling those anxieties onto a specific target.
Exactly. And the article specifically points out how accusations of Satanism have historically been used to target Jewish communities.
Which is just, it's
Mhm.
awful.
It's using this age-old trope, this really dangerous stereotype, to incite fear and distrust, and it reinforces anti-Semitism, which is never okay.
So it's not just about the belief itself, it's about the way that belief is weaponized to harm others. It's creating this us versus them mentality where anyone who doesn't fit into your specific worldview is immediately labeled as the enemy, as an agent of evil.
Absolutely. And you see this playing out in so many different ways, not just with Satanism, but it's all connected to this idea of othering, of demonizing anything that challenges your beliefs.
And it's interesting because while we're seeing this resurgence of this more traditional satanic panic, we're also seeing something else happening in pop culture, right? Like with artists like Lil Nas X, Kim Petras, Sam Smith, they're all incorporating this like satanic imagery into their music videos, their performances.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're reclaiming it or maybe even mocking it.
Yeah, it's definitely provocative, and it raises the question, are they just trying to be edgy to get a reaction? Or is there something more to it? Are they like tapping into something deeper, maybe even unintentionally giving credibility to these harmful narratives? It's a tricky line to walk.
It's like, is it harmless fun? Or are they playing with fire? Because the article does mention how, this kind of imagery can be triggering for some people, especially those who've experienced real trauma related to these kinds of accusations.
Right. And the article suggests that it's important to consider the broader cultural context, too. Like, we're living in a time where there's more visibility, more acceptance of gender and sexual diversity, especially among younger generations.
Which, for many people is a huge step forward.
Absolutely. But for some, this shift can be really unsettling. They might see it as a threat to their values, to the world they know. So for them, framing it in these, like, demonic terms, it's a way to cope with that discomfort, to resist those changes.
So instead of trying to understand these cultural shifts, they fall back on fear and demonization. It's easier to point fingers and label something as evil than to actually engage with it in a meaningful way.
It's a very human response, right? We tend to fear what we don't understand. And when you combine that with this constant influx of information, the sense that the world is changing too fast, it's easy to see how people can get swept up in these narratives. But, we've covered a lot of ground here about how this panic manifests, how it spreads, but what can we actually do about it? Like, what are some concrete steps we can take to counter this?
Yeah, it feels a little overwhelming, right? Like, how do you even begin to unpack all of this, let alone actually do something about it? I mean, it's not like there's an easy solution, a magic wand you can wave to make everyone see things rationally.
It's true. There's no quick fix. But the article does offer some guidance, some things we can keep in mind as we navigate this landscape of misinformation and fear-mongering.
Okay, so what's the game plan?
Well, for starters, the article really emphasizes the importance of informed action and, ethical engagement, especially when it comes to online spaces.
Okay, that makes sense. So, what does that look like in practice?
One thing they strongly advise against is, casually sharing or engaging with these types of narratives, even if your intention is to debunk them.
Really? I would have thought that calling out misinformation is always a good thing.
It seems counterintuitive, right? But here's the thing. Often, even when we're trying to debunk something, we end up amplifying the original message, It's like, by even talking about it, we're giving it oxygen, we're introducing it to new audiences who might not have seen it otherwise.
That's so true, especially with how social media algorithms work. Even negative attention is still attention, right?
Exactly. These algorithms, they thrive on engagement, any kind of engagement. So even if you're sharing something to debunk it, to criticize it, you're still contributing to its spread, making it more likely that other people will see it.
So it's almost like instead of fighting fire with fire, we need to be cutting off its oxygen supply.
Exactly. It's about starving these harmful narratives of attention, not giving them the satisfaction of a reaction. And, on the flip side, it's about focusing on promoting credible sources of information, amplifying voices that are grounded in facts and evidence.
So it's more about shining a light than getting caught in this endless cycle of debunking. But what about, the platforms themselves? I mean, they have to bear some responsibility here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The article is very clear about that Social media companies, they have this huge role to play in moderating content, in limiting the spread of misinformation, especially when it has the potential to incite violence, to cause real-world harm.
Which Pizzagate is a perfect example of, right?
Yeah.
Like that whole thing spiraled out of control because of the way it spread online.
Exactly. And, it's not just about taking down obviously harmful content. It's also about being more transparent with their algorithms, about giving users more control over what they see.
Right, because right now it feels like we're all just at the mercy of these algorithms and we don't even fully understand how they work. But of course, then you run into the whole debate about censorship, right? Like,
Hmm.
where do you draw the line between moderating harmful content and suppressing free speech?
It's a really tricky balance. But I think the article makes a good point, which is that there's a big difference between allowing for a diversity of opinions and allowing platforms to be used to spread blatant falsehoods, to target individuals or groups with harassment and
It's
abuse.
like freedom of speech doesn't equal freedom of consequences, right?
Exactly. It's about finding ways to protect freedom of expression while also protecting people from harm.
And it's not just about what happens online, right? Like we all have a responsibility in our own offline lives, in our own communities. The article also talked about the importance of language, of how we talk about these issues, and how even well-intentioned language can sometimes be counterproductive.
Oh, absolutely. They specifically cautioned against using dismissive labels, even if we don't agree with someone's beliefs.
So like even terms like conspiracy theorist, we should be careful about throwing those around.
Right, because often those labels, they just shut down conversation.
Mhm.
They reinforce this us versus them mentality, which is exactly what these theories thrive on.
It's dehumanizing and it makes it harder to have a productive conversation.
It's about remembering that even if we disagree with someone's beliefs, even if we find those beliefs harmful, there's still a human being behind those beliefs. And, at the end of the day, most people just want to feel heard. They want to feel like their concerns are being taken seriously. So maybe instead of immediately dismissing someone or writing them off, we can try to approach these conversations with a little more empathy, a little more curiosity.
It's about creating a space for dialogue, for understanding, even if we don't always agree. It's funny because this whole conversation, this whole deep dive, it started with this question of whether we're seeing a resurgence of satanic panic. But it feels like it's become about so much more than that?
It's true. It's about so much more than just Satanism. It's about fear and how fear can be manipulated, how it can be used to divide us. It's about the power of narratives, the way that stories, whether they're true or not, can shape our understanding of the world. And ultimately, it's about our responsibility to be critical thinkers, to be discerning consumers of information, to not just accept everything we see and hear at face value.
It's about being aware of our own biases, our own prejudices, and how those can cloud our judgment. It's about being willing to question our own beliefs, to be open to new information, even if it makes us uncomfortable. This deep dive has really given us a lot to think about, a lot to unpack. And on that note, we want to leave you with this. In this age of information overload, in a world where it feels like everyone's shouting their truth from the rooftops, how can we be more discerning about the information we consume? How can we cultivate a healthy skepticism without giving in to fear and paranoia? It's a question worth pondering, and it's something we all have a role to play in figuring out. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going.